And good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Arden, Oklahoma. And again, this is my Morning Musings. We are continuing our investigation, of course, of the Olivet Discourse. By the way, we're not long before finishing this series. I've had several good suggestions, and I'll be really honest with you. None of them have just really rang my bell about something that I wanted to do. But do me a favor, send me your suggestion for our next study. I make no promises that I'll do it, okay? Some subjects just simply don't interest me as much as others, even in the field of eschatology, okay? So it has to interest me as well as you. But feel free to send me your suggestion. Please don't get offended if I don't choose your subject, okay? I mean no offense if I don't choose a particular one. I'm not trying to be mean or unfair, but like I said, it has to be a subject that has an interest with me as well as with you. It has to be a subject that I think would have a broad-based interest among those of you who watch. And I can tell you some of the subjects that have been recommended to me in the past, in the broad spectrum of interest in the field of eschatology, they would have about that much interest. And so I just don't feel the need to spend the time, the effort to research and to study to be able to bring a series of videos. So I hope you understand that. But again, feel free to submit your suggestion. Now, I've suggested to you, I certainly did yesterday, that the relationship between Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following and Joel chapter 2 and 3 is absolutely perfect. I mean, Joel chapter 2 foretold the last days, just like everyone agrees. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is about the last days. Joel chapter 2 talks about the great day of the Lord. Matthew chapter 25, the coming of the Lord and his kingdom. Joel chapter 2, the time of salvation. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, the time of salvation. And on we could go, but I think you get the point. Joel chapter 3, verse 1, in those days, which are the last days, and at that time, which is the great and the terrible day of the Lord, of Joel 2, verse 32, which is the day of Christ's coming in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. So in those days and at that time, I will gather all nations to judgment. Obviously, Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, when the Son of Man shall come on the clouds of heaven with his angels, then shall he sit on the throne of his glory, and all nations shall be gathered before him. Now, unless you're willing to posit two times of the gathering of all nations, then guess what? These are the same. All right? So I told you yesterday that I wanted to present a few of the constituent elements of Joel 2, which is quoted verbatim in Acts chapter 2 by Peter, when Peter, defending the other 11 apostles who had been accused of being drunken when they were speaking in tongues, Peter stood up and says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. These men are not drunken as you suppose, seeing it's but the third hour of the day. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel." Do you know what's amazing to me? Absolutely amazing to me. My dispensational friends deny, are you listening? They deny that the events of Pentecost were the beginning of the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. I'll never forget, I was in a radio debate with Thomas Ice some years ago. And during that debate, I made the comment, quoting from the book Prophecy Watch, by the way, and I was quoting at the time. I didn't realize that I was quoting Timothy DeMee, who co-wrote the book with Thomas Ice. But nonetheless, I was quoting from the book. And in the book, it says Acts chapter 2 was the beginning of the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. Well, Thomas Ice just basically exploded. And he said, that is absolutely false. That is a misrepresentation. The book does not say that. And I said, it most assuredly does. And I said, by the way, if anyone wants a photostatic reprint of the pages where it said, contact me, I'll be happy to give it. And Thomas Ice said, it is not in there. Furthermore, I do not believe that quote. And I said, well, Thomas, it's in the book. And he said, well, I don't believe it. I don't believe it's in the book. And I said, it's not only in the book, but I said, Thomas, if you'll contact me tomorrow, I'll send you a photostatic copy, or just call me and I'll give you the page number. And he said, well, it may be in the book, but I don't believe it. I said, whoa, wait a minute. Are you telling us that you put your name on a book that contains statements of doctrine that you don't believe in? And he said, of course, I do it all the time. Wow. I can tell you this, we had the entire debate being broadcast to a congregation of people at the time, and they literally gasped. They could not believe what was being said. Now look, I have put my name on books that have chapters written by different people. And guess what? I very often put a caveat. I may or may not disagree or agree with the views of all of the other authors, but I'm certainly contributing my part. But that's not what was happening in that book and with Thomas Ice. So, dispensationalists, certainly Thomas Ice as a representative of dispensationalism, does not believe that Acts chapter 2 was in any way related to the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. And yet Peter said, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how could words be any clearer? The events of the day of Pentecost, in some way, in some manner, and to some degree, well, it was at least the initiation of the fulfillment of Joel chapter 2. You cannot get language any clearer than this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Peter didn't say. Now look, folks, what's happening today is a foretaste of what it will be like when Joel is really actually fulfilled. No. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Now, why is that important? Why have I spent so much time developing that? I have spent so much time developing that for the simple reason that if in fact, not really if, but since the day of Pentecost was at least the initiation of the fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel, it meant that the last days were in progress. As I've already shared with you, I was raised in a theological environment in which it was claimed that the last days began on Pentecost. Well, that's not what it says, and that's not what it means. But I won't spend any more time on that. We'll pick up the concept of the last days later. If you want more information on the identity of the last days, please go to my bookstore, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. Order a copy of the book, Last Days Identified. You'll be very, very glad you did. It might just blow your mind, but it will be ever so much helpful to you in your understanding of eschatology. So, if the events of the day of Pentecost were the events of the last days, not beginning the last days, but events belonging to and within the last days, then that means that the day of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when the Lord would gather all nations before him, wasn't far off. It most assuredly was not 2,000 years away. Notice what Joel said, what Peter quoted, when the Lord said, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your young men shall dream dreams. Your old men shall see visions. And your young men shall prophesy. So, during the last days, God would pour out his spirit miraculously, and old men, young men, and women would prophesy. And he said, I will show signs in the heaven above and in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke, before the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. Now remember, that coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord of Joel chapter 2 is the time of the gathering of the nations. The time of the gathering of the nations is Matthew 25:31 and following. And God said, I'm going to pour out my spirit, and I'm going to cause your sons and your daughters to prophesy and to serve as signs of the coming of the great and the terrible day of the Lord, when I'll gather all nations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know this is an incredibly sensitive subject, one at which and about which a lot of people get upset. They get really, really emotional. But God said, in the last days, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord, for the gathering of the nations, he would send out his spirit, and men and women would prophesy. Let me say this. There are no inspired, authoritative, infallible prophets alive today to serve as signs of the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Since we do not have infallible, inspired, authoritative prophets to serve as signs of the coming great and terrible day of the Lord, that means that either God's promise failed, which it didn't, or it means the great and terrible day of the Lord, for which the miracle served as signs, has come. Tomorrow, I'm going to demonstrate to you how that was supposed to happen. That is, the great and the terrible day of the Lord was supposed to be in the first century. And that's why we do not have today living, authoritative, inspired, and infallible prophets serving as signs of the coming great and terrible day of the Lord. Okay? Thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. I do appreciate you being with me. I'll see you on the flip side.